The first time Walter Harris walked into the courtroom, nobody saw a hero, they saw a vagrant. And the most tragic part? He didn't even bother correcting them. He stood there, shoulders hunched under the weight of a worn military duffel that probably smelled like 100 nights under wet cardboard. His boots, caked in city grime, had once carried him through desert sandstorms and enemy crossfire. Now, they squeaked embarrassingly against the polished courtroom floor. The bailiff announced his name with the same monotone used for announcing parking violations. People barely looked up until they caught sight of his skin. That's when the subtle shift began. You'd think it was invisible, but Walter had felt it 1,000 times. The quick averted glance, the tightening jaw, the judgment that came before facts. The judge, a tall, square-jawed man named William Carter, peered down over his glasses with the kind of gaze that made you feel smaller than you were. "Mr. Harris," he began, "you are here today facing charges of trespassing and resisting arrest. Do you understand the charges?" Walter nodded, his deep voice raspy from years of street-cold nights. "I understand, Your Honor." From the gallery, a whisper snaked its way through the air. "He's homeless." Another, black guy, probably a junkie. Walter didn't flinch. This wasn't new. But the young assistant district attorney, a clean-cut man in a navy suit named Daniel Reeve, leaned forward as though this was an open-and-shut case. "Your Honor, the defendant was found sleeping in the lobby of the Grant Hotel." Management repeatedly asked him to leave. When the police arrived, he became aggressive. Aggressive? Walter repeated quietly, almost to himself. "Yes," Daniel pressed. The arresting officers report that he shouted obscenities and refused to comply. Walter turned his gaze toward the prosecutor, his dark eyes calm but heavy. "You mean when I asked why I was being grabbed without a word? When I tried to keep my only bag from being thrown into the street? That's your aggression?" The judge held up a hand. "Mr. Harris, we will address your account shortly. For now, let the prosecution continue." As Daniel spoke, Walter's mind drifted not away from the case, but back into the kind of memories that hurt to remember. The smell of diesel and gunpowder in Iraq. The cries of civilians caught in the crossfire. The heat that pressed down like a physical hand. He remembered the men he carried out of burning vehicles, the sound of bullets snapping past his ears. And he remembered the medal they pinned to his chest in a tent under flickering fluorescent lights. That medal was gone now, pawned years ago for enough money to keep warm one winter. The defense attorney, a public defender named Melissa Tran, finally rose. She was young, barely 30, with fire in her eyes, but too many cases to fight with the energy each one deserved. Still, when she looked at Walter, there was something respect, maybe. "Your Honor," she began, "my client is not a criminal. He is a man who served this country for over a decade, who returned home with injuries physical and invisible and who fell through every crack in the system we pretend is there to help veterans." Daniel scoffed. "That doesn't excuse trespassing." Melissa's tone sharpened. "No. But maybe it explains why a decorated soldier ends up sleeping in a hotel lobby, because the VA shelter is full and the temperature outside is 28 degrees. The judge's brow furrowed slightly. "Decorated?" "Yes, Your Honor. Sergeant First Class Walter James Harris, recipient of the Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts." The silence that followed wasn't quiet, it was the kind that presses in, demanding attention. Even Daniel stopped flipping through his notes. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Walter didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. He knew this moment, the split second, when people realized the story was more complicated than they'd decided. The moment their certainty began to crack. The judge leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Mr. Harris, is that true?" Walter finally met his eyes. "Yes, sir. But I'm not here to make anyone feel guilty about it. I just needed a place to sleep." It was such a simple statement, stripped of pride or self-pity, that it landed heavier than any speech. Somewhere in the back row, a woman whispered, "Oh my God." What no one in that room knew not yet was that Walter had once saved the life of someone very important in that very city. And that truth, when it came out, would turn the entire trial on its head. But for now, Walter stood silently, the weight of the courtroom's shifting gaze on him, wondering if today would be the day the system decided to see him as a man, or just another statistic. The judge's pen tapped softly against the bench, a quiet metronome to the sudden heaviness in the room. For a moment, The man in the robe didn't look like a judge, he looked like someone who'd just realized he'd been handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Daniel, the prosecutor, cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. Your Honor, whatever his past service, the fact remains Mr. Harris violated private property law. His military record, while admirable, is irrelevant to the current charges. Melissa didn't flinch. Irrelevant. Is the prosecutor suggesting that the circumstances leading a man to desperation have no bearing on whether his actions were justified? We don't live in a vacuum. We live in a country that told Mr. Harris his service mattered, then abandoned him when he came home. The judge raised his hand again, his gaze darting between them. Ms. Tran, the court is not blind to hardship, but we must know, Your Honor. Melissa interrupted, voice sharp. The court has been blind. Blind to the racial bias that colors every arrest report. Blind to the fact that my client was approached with suspicion, not compassion. Blind to the reality that a black man sleeping in a lobby is seen as a threat before he's seen as a human being. Her words were a spark in dry tinder. A murmur rippled through the gallery, some shaking their heads, others nodding silently. Walter kept his eyes on the floor. He'd been in rooms like this before, not courtrooms, but command briefings, debrief tents, situations where every word could tip the balance. And he knew the rule: stay still, stay silent, and watch the tide turn. The judge exhaled slowly, then turned to Daniel. Mr. Reeve, before we proceed, does the state have any additional witnesses? Yes, Your Honor, Daniel said quickly, seizing the opportunity. The arresting officer, Officer Kent, is present and prepared to testify. From the side door, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a police uniform entered. His posture was rigid, his expression guarded. He took the oath and sat down, glancing briefly at Walter then away. Officer Kent, Daniel began, please describe the events of January 14th. Kent's voice was even, rehearsed. At approximately 11:45 p.m., my partner and I were dispatched to the Grant Hotel regarding a trespassing complaint. Upon arrival, we observed the defendant lying on a bench in the lobby, with a large bag next to him. Hotel management stated they had asked him to leave several times, but he refused. When we approached, the defendant became loud and non-compliant. Daniel nodded. Did he threaten you? Kent hesitated. Not verbally threatened, but his tone was aggressive and he refused to follow instructions. Melissa rose, pacing slowly toward the witness stand. Officer Kent, have you ever been dispatched for a similar call involving a white individual? He shifted in his seat. I can't recall specific cases. Really? She pressed. In your 5 years on the force, you can't remember once being called to remove a white person from a hotel lobby? I didn't say that. I said I can't recall specifics. Melissa stopped in front of him, her voice calm but cutting. And in those instances when the person was white, how many times did you immediately put your hands on them? Daniel shot up. Objection irrelevant. The judge frowned. Overruled. Answer the question. Kent's jaw tightened. It depends on the situation. Melissa leaned in slightly. So the situation here, man sleeping in a lobby, required you to physically grab him before you even asked if he needed help? I followed protocol. Kent replied, his tone colder now. Protocol, Melissa repeated, as if tasting the word. Tell me, officer, does protocol differentiate between a homeless white man and a homeless black man? Daniel jumped again. Objection, withdrawn, Melissa said, stepping back. She'd made her point. Walter watched the officer's jaw clench. He knew that look. It was the same look he'd seen on young soldiers when they were cornered, realizing they'd made a mistake, but unwilling to admit it in front of their peers. Melissa turned to the judge. Your Honor, we intend to call our own witness to speak to the character of Mr. Harris. Proceed, the judge said. The door opened again, and an elderly man in a wheelchair rolled forward, pushed by a younger woman. His hair was thin and white, his face marked with the deep lines of age, but his eyes sharp, bright, unshaken, locked instantly on Walter. Walter's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen that face in years. Melissa approached the bench. This is Colonel Richard Whitmore, retired. United States Army. Colonel Whitmore, do you recognize the defendant? The old man's voice was strong despite his years. Recognize him? I owe him my life. The gallery erupted in whispers. Even the judge leaned forward. Explain, Colonel. It was Fallujah, 2004, Whitmore said, his eyes never leaving Walter's. Our convoy was ambushed. My Humvee took the first hit. I was pinned inside, legs shattered, fuel leaking. I would have been ash before the medics even knew where I was. But Sergeant Harris ran straight into the fire. He pulled me out with his bare hands while rounds were still flying. He saved 3 others that day, too. That's the kind of man you have sitting in front of you. The courtroom had gone utterly still. Melissa spoke softly. Colonel, were you aware of Mr. Harris's current circumstances before today? Whitmore's face hardened. No, and I'm ashamed I didn't know. Ashamed that the Army didn't keep track of one of its best. This man bled for his country, and now his country treats him like a criminal for trying to stay warm. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, but tried to regain footing. Colonel Whitmore, while we respect your service, your testimony speaks to events over 20 years ago. It does not change what happened in that hotel lobby. The colonel's eyes flashed. Son, you don't get it. You've never had to run into hell because someone else's life mattered more than yours. That kind of man doesn't suddenly become a threat because he's cold and tired. The judge sat back, fingers steepled, gaze fixed on Walter. And that was when Walter felt it had subtle shift again, but different this time. The suspicion was still there, but now it was tangled with something rarer, doubt. Doubt in the neat little narrative the prosecution had packaged. Doubt that maybe, just maybe, the man in front of them wasn't who they'd decided he was. Melissa placed a hand lightly on Walter's shoulder as she passed. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to submit military records and commendations into evidence, as well as medical documentation regarding Mr. Harris's PTSD and service-related injuries. The judge nodded. So entered. As Melissa gathered her papers, the colonel leaned slightly toward Walter. His voice was low, meant only for him. You should have called me, Harris. I'd have come sooner. Walter gave a small smile. Didn't think anyone remembered. Heroes don't get forgotten, the old man replied. Sometimes people just need reminding. In the gallery, a few heads bowed not in prayer, but in a quiet, uncomfortable acknowledgement that maybe they'd been wrong. The judge looked at the clock. We will recess for 1 hour before closing arguments. His gavel came down with a sharp crack. As people began to file out, Walter sat still, staring at the wood grain of the defense table. He could feel eyes on him, but they didn't burn the way they had when the hearing began. Now, they lingered with curiosity, maybe even respect. Still, deep down, Walter knew something the rest of the room didn't. This wasn't over. The system didn't change its mind easily, and being right didn't guarantee freedom. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed behind Walter with a dull thud. He stepped into the hallway, the air cooler and smelling faintly of stale coffee from a vending machine down the corridor. Melissa walked beside him, a stack of papers tucked under her arm like a shield. You did well in there, she said. Walter gave her a sidelong glance. Didn't say much. Exactly, she replied. Sometimes silence does more than speeches. They passed a row of benches, where a few people from the gallery sat whispering. Some avoided his eyes. Others stared too long, as if they were trying to memorize the shape of him now that they knew his past. The colonel, still in his wheelchair, was waiting at the far end of the hall. His assistant, an efficient young woman in a gray suit, stood behind him. Whitmore waved Walter over. You've aged, Harris, the colonel said, his voice carrying the warmth of old comradeship. But not as much as I expected. Walter smirked faintly. Same to you, sir. Whitmore's expression sobered. I meant what I said in there. I'm not letting them railroad you. If I have to call in every favor I've got left, I will. Walter hesitated, the words catching in his throat. You don't owe me that. The colonel's gaze hardened. Like hell I don't. Before Walter could reply, Melissa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brows knitting. Excuse me a moment. She stepped a few feet away, speaking into the phone in a low tone. Whitmore leaned in. Tell me honestly, Harris, how did you end up here? Not just in this courthouse. Here. Walter's eyes traced the pattern of the marble floor. Got back stateside, tried to get help. VA paperwork took months. Work was hard to find when you've got a limp and nightmares. I bounced between shelters, then the shelters filled up. One night it was too cold, so I walked into the first lobby I saw. Guess that was my crime. Whitmore's jaw worked, but he said nothing. There was no quick fix for what Walter had just described. Melissa returned, her expression taut. That was my investigator. He found something interesting about the Grant Hotel. Walter raised an eyebrow. Yeah, they've had other people crash in that lobby before. Drunk tourists, runaway teens, even a couple of businessmen waiting for morning flights. None of them were arrested. Security just escorted them out. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. And all those people were white, I take it. Melissa nodded grimly. Every single one. The colonel's voice dropped to a growl. Then this isn't just trespassing. It's targeted harassment. Melissa's phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text. She read it, and her eyes widened. You're not going to believe this security camera footage from that night shows Walter asking the front desk for permission to stay until morning. The clerk tells him no, but he doesn't raise his voice, doesn't get physical. Then 2 minutes later, the manager calls the police. Walter blinked. They still got me for resisting arrest. Melissa's lips tightened. We'll deal with that in closing. The bailiff's voice echoed down the hallway. Court will resume in 5 minutes. They filed back into the courtroom. The atmosphere had shifted again. People were leaning forward in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of something about to break open. When the judge called the session to order, Melissa stood. Your Honor, before closing arguments, the defense has new evidence to submit security footage from the Grant Hotel lobby on the night in question. Daniel immediately objected. This is a last-minute submission. The judge cut him off. Objection overruled. If the evidence is relevant, the court will review it. Melissa handed a flash drive to the bailiff, who plugged it into the court's monitor. The footage played on a grainy screen mounted to the wall. There was Walter, stepping into the lobby with slow, careful movements. He approached the desk, speaking to the clerk, who shook his head. Walter nodded once, quietly, then sat on a bench. Less than 2 minutes later, the manager appeared, phone in hand. The judge watched in silence as the police entered. The footage showed them walking directly to Walter, grabbing his arm before he even stood up. Walter pulled his bag close. One officer yanked it away, and Walter stepped forward, instantly pushed against the wall. When the video ended, the room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. The judge's eyes shifted to Daniel. Mr. Reeve, would you care to explain why this footage was not included in discovery? Daniel swallowed. Your Honor, the prosecution was not aware of spare me, the judge said, his voice like cold steel. You had access to this. You chose not to use it. Melissa didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The footage had done more for her case than any speech could. She began her closing argument slowly, each word deliberate. This case isn't about trespassing. It's about how we decide, in an instant, who belongs and who doesn't. It's about a man who served his country with distinction, only to be treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin and the state of his clothes. If Walter Harris had been white, we wouldn't be here. And that, Your Honor, is the truth no one in this room can ignore anymore. Daniel's rebuttal sounded smaller now, his arguments thinner. He spoke about law and order, about property rights, but the weight had shifted. Finally, the judge folded his hands. I will take this matter under advisement and return with a verdict tomorrow at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. The gavel's crack echoed, but the real sound was the collective exhale from the gallery. As Walter stood, Whitmore wheeled up beside him. You won't be alone tonight, the colonel said. Come with me. My home's got more room than I need. Walter hesitated. You sure? I'm sure, Whitmore said firmly. And if the system has any sense left, you'll walk out of here tomorrow a free man. Melissa smiled faintly. One way or another, we'll make sure they see you for who you are. Walter glanced around the courtroom, at faces still processing the whiplash of what they'd seen. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. The next morning, the courthouse steps were busier than Walter had ever seen them. A few local reporters had caught wind of the case overnight. Cameras clicked as he approached, walking alongside Melissa and Colonel Whitmore. The colonel leaned toward him. Don't let the flashes get in your head. Keep your eyes forward. Walter gave a quiet nod, though the knot in his stomach tightened with each step toward the heavy doors. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The gallery had filled early familiar faces from yesterday's session, mixed with strangers who had clearly come just to witness the verdict. Even the bailiff's usually bored expression was sharper, as if sensing the weight of what was about to happen. The judge entered, robe swaying, and the bailiff called the court to order. His gavel came down once, crisp and final. Before I deliver my decision, Judge Carter began, there is a matter that requires clarification. In the course of reviewing the evidence submitted yesterday, I discovered additional materials that were withheld by the prosecution. Daniel stiffened in his chair. The judge's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. Hotel security logs from the last 12 months indicate 12 prior incidents of individuals sleeping in the lobby after hours. Of those 12, only one resulted in police involvement, the incident involving Mr. Harris. All other cases involved white individuals and were resolved without arrest. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Melissa's jaw tightened. Walter sat perfectly still, though his pulse pounded in his ears. Judge Carter's gaze shifted to Daniel. This selective enforcement is deeply troubling. It raises serious questions about bias, both from the complainant and potentially from law enforcement. Daniel started to speak, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. The court will not tolerate deliberate omissions. You are hereby admonished, Mr. Reeve. Turning his attention to Walter, the judge's tone softened slightly. Mr. Harris, you were charged with trespassing and resisting arrest. The evidence, including the video footage, makes clear that your presence in the lobby posed no threat and that you did not initiate aggression toward the arresting officers. The court finds you not guilty on all counts. The gavel struck. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Then a murmur rose, swelling into a round of scattered applause before the bailiff barked for order. Melissa turned to Walter, a rare smile breaking across her face. We did it. But Walter wasn't smiling, not yet. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, what happens to people like me who don't have a Colonel Whitmore to vouch for them? Who don't get lucky enough to have a public defender dig this deep? The judge hesitated. That is a question for more than this courtroom. Walter gave a slow nod. Then I hope the people in this room remember the answer when they walk out. Outside, the press swarmed. Microphones thrust toward his face. Mr. Harris, how does it feel to be exonerated? One reporter shouted. Walter glanced at Whitmore, then back to the cameras. This was never just about me. It's about every person who's been judged by the color of their skin before anyone bothered to learn their story. I had people fighting for me. Most don't. That's the real injustice. The colonel's hand gripped his shoulder. Tell them the rest, he urged. Walter nodded. And if anyone's wondering, I'd still serve again, even knowing how it turned out. Because I didn't wear that uniform for the people who turned their backs, I wore it for the ones who still believe we can be better than this. The reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, but Walter's mind had already drifted past the noise. That evening, he sat at the colonel's kitchen table, a hot meal in front of him for the first time in weeks. The warmth from the fireplace seeped into his bones. Whitmore raised a glass. To brothers in Armson and off the battlefield. Walter lifted his own, though it was just water. And to the ones we couldn't bring home. They drank in silence. Melissa, seated across from them, finally spoke. You know, the hotel's liable for what they did. If you're willing, we can file a civil suit. Not just for damages for change. Walter leaned back, staring into the fire. I'll think about it. But right now, I just want to sleep without wondering if I'll be woken up in cuffs. Whitmore chuckled softly. You'll get that here. This roof isn't going anywhere. For the first time in years, Walter let himself believe it. Weeks later, the lawsuit was filed. It made headlines not for the money sought, but for the hotel's quiet settlement and public apology. In the statement, they promised to revise their policies, train staff on bias recognition, and donate to veteran homelessness programs. Walter didn't care much for the apology, but the donation that mattered. On the day the settlement was finalized, Walter visited the VA shelter he used to sleep outside of. He handed the check directly to the director. Make sure no one else has to freeze because the beds are full, he said. The director looked stunned. You could keep this. Get yourself set up. Walter shook his head. This isn't just mine. It's for everyone who's still out there tonight. When he walked back out into the cold, he didn't feel the wind bite the way it used to. Months later, Walter sat on a park bench, the spring sun on his face. A young black man in fatigues passed by, duffel slung over his shoulder. Walter called out to him. Hey, soldier. The man stopped. Yeah. Walter smiled faintly. Welcome home. And remember, if the world forgets what you've done, you make damn sure they remember who you are. The young man grinned. Yes, sir. Walter watched him go, the weight in his chest a little lighter. He still had scars, physical and otherwise, but he also had something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The case of State versus Walter Harris faded from the headlines, but in certain corners of the city, it was still told not as a courtroom drama, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the hero doesn't ride in with a cape. Sometimes he limps in wearing worn boots, carrying a bag full of nothing. Sometimes he's the man everyone overlooked until the truth hit them like a gavel. And sometimes, just sometimes, the truth is enough to change more than one man's fate. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.